Good morning. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be with you and to have already engaged in the worship that we've been able to participate in, and I'm thankful to be here. I want to take a little bit of time this morning to consider men's clothing. Men's clothing. If you're like me, the way you heard this and the way that you were often, and the way that I've often taught this, is that a statement like at the beginning, yes, this applies to everyone, and then a sermon towards women, right? Isn't that the way we often approach it? But with the knowledge that this ends up being more directed at women, I think oftentimes those are the examples of dress that I consider and that I point out and that I address. Now, I'm going to say that, of course, the New Testament points the issue of modesty and dress more directly at women. So you can see that in 1 Timothy chapter 2, where the men are directed in certain things and the women are then told in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 10 that they need to be dressed by means of good works as is proper for women professing godliness. And then over in 1 Peter chapter 3, he makes mention of the fact there that women need to be clothed with certain characteristics. Verse 3 of 1 Peter 3, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing golden jewelry, putting on garments, but let the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible quality of a lowly and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. So obviously the New Testament does direct those things there. But I don't think that there shouldn't have been some understanding and some teaching, and I think we should do that now regarding men's dress. Now, I would say that for most of my and my predecessor's lifetime, being modest and covering the nakedness of men, which we'll talk about in just a second, was a much easier cultural concept than perhaps talking about women's clothing. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was modest. It doesn't mean that everybody did cover up their nakedness, but it wasn't as if you were really out of line with social standards if you did that. Now, we'll talk more about that in a bit, but I remember when I was growing up, the guys who were playing basketball, their shorts almost came down to their ankles. They were so baggy. And that was not considered to be something that was really out of step. Now, I'm going to talk about how that's being challenged, but as a result, the discussion about being modest and specifically about covering up nakedness was and has been much more directed at women, because I think there are times where you feel like you have to kind of step outside what the social standards would be in order to keep up with that. But I think that from the very beginning, that the Lord would have expected his people to understand that there were some lessons that should already be learned about that for both men and women. Now, why would I be concerned about this? Why would I care? Well, I think that my fundamental consideration about this is that I want to press the rule and the reign of Christ and the glory of God into every aspect of my life. I don't want there to be a single slice of my life that either I'm rejecting the will of God, or even that I haven't considered the will of God, or that I feel like I'm neutral regarding the will of God. I want every aspect of my life to have Christ's authority pressed down and into it. Now, you may draw different conclusions than I have drawn. All right. But I don't want any of us to go another step without considering how God's rule applies to everything, whether that's our dress or our time or our money or our words or our recreation. I don't want to think less about one thing. You are a new creature in Christ. Not one part of your life ought to remain untouched, untransformed, unmoved by the fact that you have named Jesus Christ as Lord. Now, whatever we do, Paul would say, even in the things you eat and drink, whatever you do it to the glory of God. I want my dress, and I want my words, and I want my relationships, and all of that to give God credit for his power. Now, it is right and it is appropriate to consider your dress, but I think we should consider a couple of different layers here, layers of clothing, I guess, about how your clothing matters. And in order to do that, I think we need a couple of definitions. The first one is nakedness, and the second one will be modesty. Now, I'm going to focus on nakedness today, and then maybe down the road we'll talk about what is modest. But I'm going to talk about clothing that covers nakedness. Now, I think that the term modest, which is the term we normally use for clothing that's appropriate, would include clothing that covers nakedness, but would go even beyond that. And that covering nakedness, I would say, is kind of the baseline consideration. Right? This is just the fundamental question. And let me illustrate that like this. If you came into our house and opened my bathroom door, I would not be concerned that the towel that I grabbed to cover myself was not really suitable for the occasion, right? It's Sunday morning. What I would be concerned about doing is covering the nakedness very quickly, right? That would be the primary. So there's kind of a fundamental basis, and then we worry about the appropriateness after that. So nakedness means that there are parts of your body that when they are exposed, they ought not be. Now, generally, when we use the word nakedness, we think we're talking about the word total nudity. But that is completely exposed with not a thread of clothing. But that's not the way the Bible uses the term nakedness. And I appreciate that my boys, if they see somebody dressing in, man, they're naked, right? They use that term because I hope that that's the way that I'm using the term, that there are aspects of a person's body that when exposed qualifies as nakedness, even if there might still be some parts that are covered, because the Bible will still describe a person as naked given what is exposed. Now, the term modesty is a word that describes what is appropriate. That might be with regard to the situation or to the occasion. I think that this is a concept that does have its roots in your heart's attitude with regard to what you're trying to say with your clothing. So sometimes we talk about our dress in the assembly. I think there are lots of things to consider when we consider the clothes that we wear to the assembly. One thing that I think we have on the list is we want to show that we consider this as an important gathering occasion. Another thing that we have to consider is that God says specifically in James 2 not to reject people who don't dress in the same level you do, maybe because of affordability or because of whatever. And then on another thing is we want to consider not only what I would consider what makes this important, but we want to consider the attitudes of the brethren because I don't want to be a distraction to anybody. So there's lots of things that would make our dress modest. Now, I don't think that modesty only includes nakedness, though I think that would be, as I've got it illustrated on the chart, I think that's part of it. And the reason that's important is my dad one time was having a discussion, and I guess this was when he was much younger, I don't know, but he was having a discussion with someone about what was modest, right? And by what he meant modest was he was using that as a term for covering nakedness. And the other person made the argument that if they were wearing a bathing suit on the beach and he was dressed in a suit, that he would be the one that was immodest because it wasn't appropriate to the occasion. You see what they're saying? Now, the challenge with that is there is a sense in which a suit on the beach isn't what's used for the occasion. But I don't think that's the fundamental consideration that needs to be made, right? The fundamental consideration that needs to be made is covering up nakedness. And at the beach, what's appropriate to the situation is not really the most important consideration, right? Now, there are situations in which modesty is extremely appropriate to be considering in that regard. Now, let me say this. I think that modesty in the New Testament passage, modesty often has the idea of wearing flashy and brandishing certain clothing and accessories and making a display out of ourself. Now, I think that the word modesty could work as a good umbrella term, but I want us to make sure that we understand that we want to start with the covering of the basic essentials of covering nakedness, and then after that, we can progress to the idea of appropriateness and what we're trying to convey in our clothing. I don't think those are irrelevant questions. Please don't misunderstand. I think appropriateness is absolutely a good conversation. But I want to start where I think the scriptures start with regards to clothing. Now, I want to consider the exposure of nakedness. Nakedness exposure is a shameful thing. One way that you can know that is in Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 6. The Bible is very careful often in how it describes sexual immorality. And one thing that I find really interesting in Leviticus chapter 18 is the way that that Moses, the way that it's written to talk about sexual immorality, is to say that engaging in that is to expose the nakedness. Look at that and look at chapter 18 and verse 6. None of you shall approach any blood relative of his to uncover nakedness. I am Yahweh, I am the Lord. As you read through that, that will be repeated over and over and over and over regarding various types of immoral and illicit types of intercourse. But the phrase that's used to stand in the place of that is uncovering nakedness. That was sufficient to show this is a shameful and abominable thing to be engaged in, was exposing the nakedness, right? And I think that that should tell us something about how God feels about our nakedness being exposed, doesn't it? It shows us that he's able to use it as a, maybe we would say a euphemism or a stand-in word for something extremely illicit. I will say, I understand that sexual immorality goes further down the line than exposing nakedness. But notice that God uses the phrase exposing nakedness to talk about that worst thing. Now, in Isaiah chapter 47, what we see in some of the prophets is that the prophets use this to talk about what the people of Judah would experience when judgment came on them. This is Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 3. And the text there says, your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your disgrace shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one. I am sure that there were occasions where these prisoners were actually stripped of their clothing. But I think the point here is not to say specifically you're going to have your clothing taken off. I think he's saying you're going to be put to shame. You're going to be disgraced. And the way that Isaiah communicates that is that your nakedness is going to be exposed. That was going to be something that was shameful. And so he's saying here, if they understood what it meant for their nakedness to be exposed, they would have understood that they were going to be put to shame. They were going to be disgraced, is the way it's described there. Then over in Lamentations, right after the book of Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 8, Jeremiah writes there, and he says, Jerusalem sinned greatly, therefore she has become an impure thing. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. Even she herself sighs and turns away. So the idea here is of the city's nakedness being exposed. So I don't think we're talking about a particular person with their clothes off. I think we're talking about a sense of shame and disgrace. And what is used to communicate that? Nakedness being exposed. It's shameful. Now, I think we can say stronger things about nakedness than that, but at least we can come to this level that it is a disgrace, it is a shame, it ought to be disgraceful to us. Now, some people say, and I think they're right about this, that the New Testament does not address the issue of nakedness as much as the Old Testament does. I think that's right. I don't think it speaks to it. But let me make the case to you that that's because fundamental principles were already laid down. So that as we begin to talk about dress, we should not have to go back and reestablish covering nakedness. And one way I know that is because in Revelation 3 and verse 18, Jesus says to the church at Laodicea, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may become rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself, and that the shame of your nakedness will not be manifested, and eye salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. The way that Jesus communicates to Laodicea that they can escape the embarrassing, disgraceful, shameful situation that they are in is they need something to cover their nakedness. So while the Bible might not give us the specific terms for covering nakedness in the New Testament, it doesn't treat nakedness as anything less shameful. And so in order to understand what nakedness is, we're going to have to rely on the Old Testament scriptures, but don't misunderstand that the New Testament cares about that kind of thing, because nakedness is still embarrassing before the Lord. Now, what I want to do now is to say that nakedness is a shameful thing. That the Lord could just use the phrase nakedness to convey something shameful and embarrassing. So we want to avoid that because of how the Lord views it. Now, when we talk about modesty, we may be talking about something that is considered appropriate for a social situation by the cultural environment that's around us. But nakedness and covering is more fundamental than that. Let me use this as an illustration. In the 1800s, how did most people dress? Lots of clothing on, right? I was listening to a podcast or something yesterday about Zachary Taylor. He was president, and he was elected. Oh boy, I'm a history teacher, and I can't remember. I believe he was elected in 1840, and he was a guy who wanted to prove himself. So he wore his vest and his sport coat and his overcoat to a July 4th celebration in July in Washington, D.C., right? That was the way he felt it would be appropriate to dress. And he died of a heat stroke, right? And Millard Fillmore, which is the president you don't know anything about, took over for him, right? So think about that. What was appropriate was lots of layers of clothing. Now, does the Bible speak to wearing what's appropriate? Maybe to some degree that we should be concerned about that. But what's nakedness is more fundamental than that. And what I mean by that is I'm not asking people to go back to the standards of 1737 to figure out how to dress. I'm not asking people to go back to 1957 to ask people how to dress. What I'm considering this morning is how do we cover our nakedness? And I think that goes all the way back to the very beginning. And what we can do then is say, once I've got that covered, then I can ask questions about appropriateness or cultural, my society or something like that. So let's talk about that. So let's go back to the beginning. The Bible does, in fact, define nakedness, and it defines what ought to be covered. So Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25, we see that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed, right? Were not ashamed even with their nakedness exposed. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, this is after the sin, the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. Now, I want you to notice what happens here. Should they have been ashamed of each other's nakedness? I don't think so, because they were husband and wife. But they recognize this is not the kind of thing that ought to be exposed. And so they make loin coverings to cover themselves. And they heard of the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God in the midst of the trees of the garden. And Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Now I want you to think about this timeline here. They are, I would assume, totally nude. They make loin coverings that would cover maybe what we would call the essentials, right? And then God is looking for them. "Where are you?" And Adam said, "I had to hide because I was naked." Oh, no, you weren't naked, right? You had covered up this. Now, you might not have had as many. No. He says, "I was naked." Now, I want you to notice down in verse 11. And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" It seems to me that the Lord is agreeing with Adam in this conversation here. Now, notice verse 21. Then Yahweh God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. What we see is that Adam and Eve, covering up what we might think of the essentials, did not cancel out nakedness and did not count as being clothed, right? what we might think of as our undergarments, was not enough to clothe them, and it was not enough to cancel out their nakedness. Now, the word translated garment in my text, some texts translate it robe or coat or tunic, depending on, and one lexicon defined it as a long shirt-like garment, usually of linen, and some suggest that it went from the shoulder to the knees. Now, I'm not going to use this as the definitive marker, but that's something that should get our attention. At least it's more than a loin cover. At least it's more than a loin cover. Now, at the least, we must say that nakedness, covering nakedness, includes more than covering up the essentials. There is more that needs to be covered to be considered not naked. Now, we can work our way through the scripture and see that God has indicated what nakedness is and what needs to be covered in order for there to be no nakedness. So flip over, if you can, to Exodus chapter 28. Exodus 28 and verse 42. With regard to the priest, he says, you shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their bare flesh, or to cover their nakedness. They shall reach from the loins even to the thighs. In that phrase, I think the thighs are being indicated as included, not being out of that. Somebody says, well, it says from here to the thighs. But I think that when we look in the Old Testament, that from one to the other is very often inclusive of both. And let me give you one example of a passage that I think shows that. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 13, for from the least of them even to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for gain, and from the prophet even to the priest, everyone practices to lie. Notice what he's saying. From the least to the greatest. From the prophet to the priest. That's not saying somebody in the middle of the least and the greatest are all that's under consideration. It's saying all of it. From the least to the greatest. So from the hips to the thighs. Now, Isaiah chapter 47, verse 1, which we already looked at a little bit just a few moments ago. Isaiah 47 and verse 1 says, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. For you shall no longer be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind the flour. Uncover your veil, strip off the skirt, uncover your leg, cross the rivers. Your nakedness will be uncovered. Your reproach also will be seen. I will take vengeance and will not spare a man. That idea of uncovering the leg, your translation may say thigh. That word is translated thigh most of the time in the Old Testament. Now, one more passage with regards to these definitions. In Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 7, Ezekiel 16 and verse 7, he says, I made you, talking to Judah, numerous like the plants of the field. Then you grew up, became tall, and came into the age of your fine ornaments. Your breasts were formed, and your hair had grown, yet you were naked and bare. And so the idea of the chest being exposed counted as nakedness too. Let me also make mention that in Exodus 28, with regards to the priest covering, that was a just-in-case situation. Right? It was as he went up the steps so that his nakedness would not be exposed. One other passage along those lines in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 26, and you shall not go up by steps to my altar so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. You hear that? It's not just about what they wear, but it's about the positions that they take so that their nakedness is not accidentally exposed. So it's not just a matter of covering it, it's covering it so that as you do whatever activity you are engaged in, that's still not covered. And you might say, but he's going up to offer a sacrifice. Surely it's okay to go up steps. So God says, no, don't go up steps. Why? Because I don't want you to expose your nakedness. I don't want somebody to be able to see that. So just in case. Now, let me say this because I'm talking to boys for the most part, or men. So most of you men don't have a problem with this. Some of you boys, I don't know. But you might say, well, what about something like in a locker room? And I think this would raise a question about that. I think I've known people who had questions about that. And I would say that I think that there are particular occasions where when the men were all gathered with other men, that this doesn't seem to be as much the issue. Now, I realize we live in a world where maybe it is an issue. But I think the world of the first century was a lot like that world. And it seems to be that the Lord made some allowances in that way. Let me give you an example. So Brother Creighton read for us from John chapter 13, which is perfectly appropriate because one of the things we want to consider is love for our neighbor as we make these decisions about dress. But one of the things that happens is that as Jesus is going to wash their feet, he lays aside his outer garment. I would take it to be that Jesus would not have gone around without that outer garment on because of what it covered. But here he's washing their feet, and so he takes that off and then engages in the service of washing their feet. Another example, and maybe this one's even more clear, is in John 21. Peter was on the boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and he sees someone on the shore and suspects that it's Jesus. Now get the picture here. He's in the boat, and the text tells us that he took his outer garment and put it on because he had stripped for work, is what the text says. And then he jumped in the water and swam to the coast. Now, think about that. Peter putting on extra clothes to swim. That's not how the world works today, is it? Right? But what Peter is doing is, I take it to be that he's been in the sea, probably with just men, people like the apostles. He's doing his work out there, but when he is going to go back to where people will see him, he actually puts on clothes, even though it's going to require him swimming in the water in his outer coat. You see what's happening? I think there is an appropriate place in which men could be less clothed. If you don't want to, not encouraging it. If you know of other situations, not saying you have to. I'm just saying you don't have to be as concerned about that. Now, let me make a few applications before our time is gone. We are in a moment where short shorts are considered in style for boys, right? You go to a high school in Franklin County and you'll see short shorts. So much so that the tan lines are in a place where you would not expect them. It's quite strange. Now, what I would say, they kind of look like John Stockton from the 80s playing basketball, or worse. I'm not just criticizing that because it's silly, but because it's exposing nakedness, as far as I can tell, from what the scriptures say. I think the primary problem for men has probably been going shirtless throughout time in exposure to others. So what would the Lord have to say about those things? Well, he doesn't explicitly address your Nike short shorts in the scripture. But he does define what nakedness is, and he does express his feelings about exposing nakedness, that it's shameful, disgraceful, and as we saw in Exodus 28, that it's even an abomination. So I think there's some consideration that we need to make. Now, it is really important that we understand what's going on here. The issue is not just what causes lust. That was the way I was taught about modesty as I was growing up. That you had to dress in a particular way so that people didn't lust. Now, I want to do the best I can not to be a stumbling block. That's why I look the way I do. I don't want to be a stumbling block to anybody. So I hadn't, made any improvements. But I promise you, I am so pale. And when I first wrote these notes, I put skinny. But now I have such a gut that I could mow my grass with no shirt on in front of my yard, and nobody would be tempted to lust. Nobody. All right? But that's not the point alone, is it? That's not the point. The point is, I don't want my nakedness exposed. I want to please God, and I don't want to be disgraced. I don't want to be ashamed. And so I need to cover my nakedness. Everybody seems to agree that there's a proper time and place and around certain people that they are okay with being less than fully clothed that wouldn't be appropriate in other situations. So one illustration might be, what some of the boys wear to the beach, and you say, okay, just sit down across the table from your mom and eat dinner like that. No. And let me say that would also apply to young ladies, I think, as well. Or sit down across from dad and no, of course. But all of a sudden on the beach, it's okay. I'm not so sure about that. When I was in college, my freshman year, there was a young lady who worshiped at one of the congregations close by. She was from Coleman, and she ran cross country in college. Well, the cross country college girls dressed horribly as far as covering up nakedness. But she said her defense of it was, I don't think anybody's lusting after me while I'm running cross country. That may very well be true. People have their minds on other things, I'm sure. But that doesn't fix covering up the nakedness. So I don't think we can justify what's covered or what's exposed based on the situation. Now, somebody says, I know you turn to those passages, and I know you've shown what God considers as nakedness, and I know that that's a shame, but that's not the standard. That's not the standard. Okay. There may be questions that I still have about the appropriateness of certain garments. Your line might be looser than mine. But how are you establishing your standard? It may be that the lines that I'm drawing are not the right lines, but I'm trying to use the Word of God to draw them. And I don't want to be excessive, but I don't want to be behind on what God has decreed, on what He has shown. I have preached this lesson before, and actually people have come up to me and said, thank you, because I wasn't sure, older men said, I wasn't sure if I should wear shorts, right? Even ones, or I wasn't sure that I could wear this or that. And they were saying, this gives me a definition to be able to define what nakedness is so that I can have that covered up. Now, everybody draws lines somewhere, I assume. Everybody here would draw a line somewhere. I want God to show me the lines. Now, covering our nakedness does, in fact, take off some of the burden of being a stumbling block off our shoulders. When I was in high school, I had a cousin who was making the argument that if modesty, if all that was making sure that somebody else didn't lust, to what degree did we need to go to cover up? Do I have to wear long sleeves? Do I need to wear a mask? If that's what I have to do to keep somebody from lusting, do I need to wear a potato sack bag? A flour sack bag, I guess. Potato sack bags are clear and holy. I don't think that's a good idea. Right? Do I have to wear that? And I would say, I don't think you do. I think you've got to cover up the nakedness in an appropriate way. And when the nakedness is covered, sure, somebody I know or appreciate may have a stumbling block that I take into extra consideration. But as a general rule, I think covering up your nakedness takes that burden off of you. And you say, well, why would the burden be on me at all? Because if we serve as a stumbling block by disregarding the will of God, then we stand in very much the same position as the person who commits the sin. And you may think that that's heavy, but it is in fact the case because we see over and over and over in the scriptures that people who lead others to sin by their disregard of God's will are in fact held accountable as well. So those who give encouragement or enticement to sin are considered guilty just as the person engaged in it. And I think that the key issue is that it is shameful for you to be naked, so don't be. Now, let me flip the script. I've only been talking to the men, can't you tell? But let me say that if they need to cover up their nakedness, then the women do as well. And I don't see any reason why we wouldn't define nakedness in just the same way. Well, that's the lesson. Again, let me say, I know that that seems like a picky topic. I know that seems like a small, minute thing. I want you to walk away with this truth, that not one thing in our life is too small to be concerned about the will of God about it. Nothing. Because I have declared that He is Lord, that He is King. He rules. And He doesn't just rule what I do in here from 9:30 to 10:20 on Sunday morning, 10:30 on Sunday morning. He rules every moment. And so if Jesus is not Lord of your life, make Him so by confessing Him as Lord and being buried with Him in that watery grave so that you can be raised to walk in newness of life. Then you will be a new creature. And if you have declared that Jesus is Lord, but there is some aspect of your life that you have left unruled, make a change. Yield that to Him as well. And if you need help in that regard, there are lots of people who have made the very same commitment that you have and have struggled to let every part of their life be ruled by Jesus and wants to work together with you so that we can all be more like what we want to be. If we can help you in any of those ways, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact